Gwendolyn Brooks was in America writing about the experience of those who stayed back and watched the men go off to war for World War II. While she was writing, there was another poet who was experiencing World War II as an American from the Western Front in Europe, and this was Richard Wilbur. And Richard Wilbur published his first collection of poetry in 1947. It was called The Beautiful Changes and Other Poems, and it's one of the most striking debuts from a wartime poet that was ever published. And the poems go back and forth between being explicitly about, looking into the eyes of a Nazi officer. That's one of the poems. And then being about the beauty of the natural world, but then going and looking at the death and destruction of war and moving back and forth. And a very famous sonnet comes out of this collection. It's actually one of the last poems in the collection. It's called Praise in Summer. And this isn't explicitly a World War II sonnet. And yet I think it's engaged in a lot of the ideas that Wilbur is playing with, explicitly relating them to World War II, but then taking his World War II experience and thinking about the nature of just human experience in general. So this is called Praise in Summer. Obscurely, yet most surely called to praise, as sometimes summer calls us all, I said, the hills are heavens full of branching ways, where star-nosed moles fly overhead the dead. I said, the trees are mines in air. I said, see how the sparrow burrows in the sky. And then I wondered why this mad instead perverts our praise to uncreation, why such savors in this wrenching things awry. Does sense so stale that it must needs derange the world to know it? To a praiseful eye, should it not be enough of fresh and strange that trees grow green, and moles can course in clay, and sparrows sweep the ceiling of our day? This poem is one that I think can be read as like, it's a pretty simple poem, but there's a lot of sonic density in it. And it's a thought project that I think really is coming out of a sort of World War II experience. The World War I generation had written a poetry, we think The Wasteland, or the poetry of someone like Wilfred Owen, which we should probably do some videos on. They were talking about the horrors of war and, can a man ever be happy again, or, ever trust or see beauty again after the horrors of war. That's not what this poem is about, though. This poem is more subtly talking about shifts in our understanding and thinking that take place in art that maybe aren't necessarily good for us. So that first line has a lot going on in it. Obscurely, yet most surely called to praise. As sometimes summer calls us all, I said. And then he talks about the hills, the moles, the trees, and the sparrows. Obscurely, yet most surely. He's saying, I am called to praise, surely, but also obscurely. And I think we can read that in a few ways. Maybe the call to praise is obscure. It's not entirely clear. Or maybe he's called to praise obscurely, to praise in a way that's odd and strange and maybe off in a corner, maybe even a little hidden. As sometimes summer calls us all. That's just a wonderful phrase. Pretty simple, but you have that sometimes summer calls us all. Lots of S's and L sounds in there. That's wonderful. Well, first M's and then L's. I said, the hills are heavens full of branching ways, where star-nosed moles fly overhead the dead. I said, the trees are mines in air. I said, see how the sparrow burrows in the sky. So each of these are images. We have these sort of four things, hills, moles, trees, sparrows, that he's using opposite language for. So the hills are heavens full of branching ways. The hills are not heavens. The heavens are above the hills usually, but what if we imagine the hills as heavens? What if we imagine the moles that burrow in the earth as flying? And that's interesting, fly overhead the dead. There's this sense of, the bodies in the earth lying there. This bodies in the earth wouldn't be for Wilbur this, obscure, like, oh yes, I've maybe seen a funeral or two. I imagine that there are people in the earth. He was he was on the front. He was with the dead, and likely thought often that he would become one of the dead very soon. I said the trees are mines in air. So instead of sticking up into there, they're like mines. They're burrowing down. So at first we had the hills are imagined with heavens language and sky language. And now the things that are up in the air are being imagined as sort of going deep language. The trees are mines in air. I said, see how the sparrow burrows in the sky. Kind of a wonderful, like, oh yeah, we wouldn't think of burrowing, but that can work. It's interesting because he's not just describing this. He's saying, I said this. I called to praise. I praised this way. And then, this is interesting. This is line 7. We've talked before about how sonnets often have a turn, a consideration of an idea, and then a turn toward a further consideration, or maybe refutation, or questioning. The turn happens earlier than usual in a sonnet. This is between 6 and 7. And then I wondered, why this mad instead? Instead, I think instead is italicized. It's sort of, instead of just describing it regularly, I'll describe it in kind of this cool opposite way. I wondered why this mad instead, mad there I think is that the old-fashioned word of crazed or not quite in our right mind, not like the angry mad. This mad instead perverts our praise to uncreation. This is very like I think extreme language. This is not why do we have to make it a little weird? It's why are we perverting it to uncreation? He's being very harsh about what he says he said, and yet he's I think maybe overemphasizing it to make a point. Perverts our praise to uncreation. Why such savors in this wrenching things awry? I think maybe we're getting more at the true worry here. We're not literally uncreating the world, though we may be miscreating in our language. But he says, why do we savor wrenching things awry? And someone who is writing in the aftermath of war, surely. This wrenching things awry, he's seen it on a global, national scale. But now he's interested in how that happens in language. That we're not just wrenching things awry in politics or in global diplomacy. We're wrenching things awry in the very way we try and praise. This is going back to kind of like King David, Psalms era stuff. If we're going to praise either the creation or the God of creation or both, why must we pervert it? It's a really interesting question. It's a question I think we have to ask ourselves when we're, here's a cool new way to say it. Are we savoring wrenching things awry in a way that's inappropriate? Does sense so stale that it must needs derange the world to know it? That derange the world to know it sounds a lot like what the modernists often say that they're doing, trying to dislocate language into meaning. That's a phrase from Eliot in 1921. Wilbur in 1947 is saying, well, why do we think we need to do that? Maybe we don't. Maybe we need to turn back to a sanity and a wholesomeness. And he says, to a praiseful eye, should it not be enough of fresh and strange that trees grow green and moles can course in clay and sparrows sweep the ceiling of our day? In one sense, he's being a little bit boring at the end here. It's cooler to think of sparrows burrowing in the air. And yet he's so chastised us and so made us wonder about whether we should be doing that I'm very touched. And I think, American literary history has been very touched by him going back to trees are green, moles course in clay, and sparrows sweep the ceiling of our day. That's sweep the ceiling. is really lovely. I won't say he's showing off. I'm tempted to say he's showing off there, but I get comments saying, how dare you say he's showing off? He's just using language well. Well, I think that's what I mean when I say showing off. But there's something, I think, if this poem works for you, where sparrows sweeping the ceiling of a day, sparrows being in the sky, has been renewed and been re-enchanted and become kind of magnificent and awesome and awe-inspiring. If the sonnet works, and I think the sonnet does work. Thanks for hanging out with this poet. Richard Wilbur is someone who we haven't talked a lot about on this channel, but this is his, a version of his new and collected poems. I think there's a more recent edition since this was published. But he's a poet that wrote from the 40s through, the turn of the millennium, and has one of the most important corpuses of formal poetry in the American tradition. And I think Wilbur and Brooks are two good examples of poets who continued to experiment with poetry and yet keep that formal and traditional approach, and really worried and wondered about and were, I think, conscientious in their inventive use of language, because they knew it had implications for their view of the world and for those who read them's view of the world. They didn't want to be irresponsible, and yet they wanted to tell the truth about sometimes great tragedy and great heartbreak, but in a way that would continually turn toward goodness and healing. And it's something it's a reason why I really like both Brooks and Wilbur. I don't know if they ever met each other, but I think they're two of the most important poets of the mid and later centuries. I want to talk a little bit about British sonnets next, and look at some major British sonneteers of the 20th and maybe even the 21st century before it's time for a summer break.